Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's discussion on South Sudan's current political and security landscape. I'm Khristopher Carlson. I oversee the HSBA project on Sudan and South Sudan at the Small Arms Survey, and I'll be moderating our conversation today. We'll have about 60 minutes, so I hope you're all able to stick around. We'll begin with just a brief presentation from each of our speakers, then a short moderated discussion, and then pivot to a Q&A. So I encourage everyone to use the Q&A button for your questions, and of course, feel free to provide those questions at any time. We'll try our best to give everybody enough time and cover as many of those questions as we can. Just first, before we jump into things, I want to mention that in the coming weeks, we have 3 HSBA publications that will be released, one on Bol Mel and succession politics. Another is a report on conflict in Western Equatoria and Western Bar Ghazal. And a third briefing paper on the new white armies and some of the recent mobilizations that have happened up there. These 3 publications are supported, as is this webinar, by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Those 3 papers together form a lot of the analytical backdrop, I suppose, for today's discussion. So please look out for those publications in the coming weeks. So where are we with things in South Sudan? Well, at present, we're looking at a moment where multiple pressures on South Sudan's political system, including uncertainty over succession, the continued unraveling of the 2018 revitalized peace agreement, intensifying conflict in Western Equatoria and Western Bar Ghazal, and recent White Army mobilizations in Upper Nile and Jonglei, are intersecting in rather worrying ways, and we're going to dive into that today with our 3 speakers. And so to help us make sense of all of that, the 3 who are with us today include Joshua Craze, a researcher and writer with over 15 years of experience in South Sudan, and the most prolific of writers for the HSBA project over these many years. And he's written on South Sudan and many other outlets as well, including the New York Review of Books and too many that for me to mention here. Next up after Joshua is our good friend and colleague Bol Gatkouth, a political analyst and former MP for Nasser. Bol is also a longtime consultant and contributor to HSBA research and publications all the way back to the very beginning of this project in 2005. So Bol, it's fabulous again to see you, and welcome to the webinar. James Kunhiak is from Lake State, and James is an independent researcher on governance and conflict dynamics with prior roles at UNESCO, UN Women, and Safer Worlds. James, thank you very much for joining us today. With that, I'd like to begin by asking each of our speakers to briefly frame how they see this current. Joshua, I'm going to start with you. Mention again your forthcoming HSBA reports, which highlight pressure within Kiir's governing system, including what you have done with these papers in highlighting the centralized family-centered decision-making mechanism of it, as well as within your other publications, the emergence of multiple conflict fronts within the peripheries, as mentioned within Western Equatoria, Western Bar Ghazal, and Jonglei and Upper Nile. Joshua, if you could, please characterize what is happening right now in South Sudan, and what these dynamics, with those dynamics, what do you see is really some of the key factors in driving current instability in South Sudan? So Joshua, over to you.
Thanks, Khristopher. An honor to be here with James Kunhiak and Bol Gatkouth, my good friends. And thank you all for attending this. I think we have to recognize that the demand for a succession is largely driven by international actors who are interested in getting out of this situation and are tired of thinking the same things. But the reality is that Salva Kiir is not interested in a succession plan. And one of the publications that will come out next week, I think, or the week after, looks at the history of Bol Mel, traces his emergence in the businessman who came to power and came to money in the aftermath of the peace agreement in 2005 and their manipulation of SSPDF contracts and the financial flows coming into Juba. But Bol Mel, of course, despite the fact that every diplomat I spoke to sort of bounced him up as the successor, went the same way as everyone else, went the same way as Nyal Denyal, went the same way as the Kol Korkuch. What's happening in that process? Well, I think what's happening in that process is that Salva does two things. One, he builds up people, he allows them to express power, and at that moment, he knocks them down. And the figures he's knocked down after Paul Malong Awan have all been figures that are effectively functional for his regime. If you look at Bol Mel and if you look at a Kolkur, they're both figures that don't have a large political constituency. Neither do they have a military base. Bol Mel has very little popularity in Northern Bahr el Ghazal, despite his best efforts. So these become functional figures for his regime. And part of the function of that regime is to build them up and knock them down. And at the same time as he is doing that, there is another strategy, which I think is a core part of what I would call Kiirism, which is to not just back one person, but to also back their rival. And he's proved an absolute master at supporting two people at once, so they fight against each other. And if you look, for instance, at the alternations of Tukyok Gatluak coming into office, coming out of office, and coming out of office again, you see that he is a master at keeping people unstable, playing them against each other, because there isn't a succession plan. The plan is for Salva Kiir to stay in office for as long as possible. And I think part of the reason for that is the structure of South Sudanese politics as it has been created by the system of Kiirism. And part of that strategy is that it's not a strategy at all. It's tactical. What do I mean by that? For instance, if you look at what happened to the Ministry of East African Affairs, it was Deng Alor, the great figure from Abyei. And then he was removed and Gideon came in. How long did Gideon remain in office? Less than 24 hours before Bieng, another figure from Abyei, came in. Why did he come in? He came in because the Abyei lobby went to Salva and was like, we can't not have anyone in the cabinet. That's not possible. So Kiir again defers. What he does with these appointments is he constantly mediates between rivalrous coalitions that are then forming and reforming as a result of his decisions. So this is the time span of South Sudanese politics. The time span is about 2 weeks. It's not 4 years. So there isn't the possibility of a stable succession plan. And I was posing this to one of Kiir's relatives in Juba back in July. And I said to him, but there has to be a succession. And he was like, no, there will never be a succession. And I was impertinent and said, look, at some point, Salva will die. And he said, well, at that point, it's the person nearest the phone who realizes that Salva is dead that will have the first bid for power. Which is to say that if you look at a lot of these movements, these changes, they're really about very granular people inside the office of the president. They're about literally who gets to make the appointment form for the president, right? Like the question of Rita and the office manager and who became the ambassador to Rwanda, these were really questions about literally access to Salva. And I think that's part of why you have this seemingly very haphazard set of appointments when no minister can establish themselves with a plan, because they end up just constantly having to fight for their position. And that also gives a certain logic of resource exploitation. Because then what happens is, you might be in, like James Kongshor, the governor of Upper Nile, for only 6 months. So you get as much as possible. There's no point of having a developmental plan, not that there's any money to have one anyway. So what you have to do instead is maximize your resources because you know that you'll be removed. But within that plan, one of the noticeable things is that you haven't seen in the last 3 years the same set of rebellions that characterized, for instance, 2010 in the elections and the exclusion of Angelina Teny, Georgia Thor, a whole variety of different figures who stood as independents. And I think the reason for that also is that the circulation of power is this constant iterative process where people know that if they come out, they will eventually be brought back. So I remember in 2019 going to see a militia commander in Western Bahr el Ghazal who had defected to the government, and he was staying in a very small hotel in Juba in a bunk bed, and he was waiting for a call from Salva. And I said, how long are you going to wait? How long have you been waiting for the call? He says, 6 months. But I wait. I know I will get that call. And he finally did get that call in 2025, where he was redeployed again to Western Bahr el Ghazal to fight against the growing SPLA-IO organization. So I think in terms of the logic of power in Juba, what you see is this increased fractionalization, this fighting for positions that's taking place against a backdrop of economic austerity. And then in the peripheries, really over the last year, we've seen an intensification of a process that began way back in 2005, at the latest in 2013, which is that power in the center is created by the manipulation of the peripheries. And I think the current counterinsurgency that the government is waging really has three elements, and two of those are old and one of those is new. One of the old elements is, of course, that they're fighting for checkpoints. This war doesn't begin in March with the Nasser incident that saw the White Armies take over the SSPDF barracks in Nasser, an event we should add that Riek Machar really had nothing to do with. It begins really in November and December 2024, when the government tries to take over IO checkpoints in Western Bahr Ghazal, Western Equatoria, and Upper Nile. Why is it trying to take over those checkpoints? Well, because the conditions of economic austerity in Juba, in which oil money is increasingly only flowing to a very limited elite, means that Salva has very intelligently adapted. And rather than trying to pay off commanders with oil money, what he tries to do is distribute licenses. So basically, you get the creation of individual fiefdoms where commanders are allowed to control their own checkpoints. So what he tries to do in this war for checkpoints that began last year is eradicate income revenues to putative members of the opposition, while at the same time distribute those licenses to commanders that he wants to give the approval to. So that's the first part of the current counterinsurgency. It's the elimination of economic flows to the opposition and the distribution of licenses to those he wants to reward. The second point is that, and this is the new point, is that there is an air campaign. And that air campaign we haven't seen in this intensity during the South Sudanese civil war. This is an air campaign that has been outsourced to Ugandan companies, largely, flying with foreign pilots. And what is the point of the air campaign? It's important to underline, this is not a war for territory. The government has no capacity to take places like Ayod, Fangak outside of the river. What it intends to do instead is to control crucial trading corridors so it can control the checkpoints. So, for instance, Wau into Warap, or the Zaraf and White Nile River corridors, and keep the opposition fragmented, displaced, and immiserated. So you see continual air bombardment of civilian villages, of hospitals, of places that the White Army might mobilize, because what it wants to do is disrupt those populations. But it can't hope to win the war. Why can't it hope to win the war? Because this government suffers an acute lack of popular legitimacy. Around the country, very few people will go, yes, what I've seen since the peace agreement in 2018 are dividends, our development, our economic prosperity. These are all impossibilities. So instead, what it's done is outsource the war. It's a very peculiar conflict because it's a conflict that almost nobody wants to fight. And, having spent time recently in Upper Nile and Jonglei, even the opposition doesn't particularly want to fight because it doesn't think it can win, because it suffers sorely from a lack of external resources. But even the SSPDF don't want to fight because they haven't been paid, because they don't think they can win the war. And so you see widespread desertions from Budabe, from Nasser town, going all the way back down into the GPAA. So instead, it's effectively outsourced the war to local militias. So you have a national air campaign fought by mercenaries, outsourced mercenaries, paid for by oil money. And on the ground, you have militias which are fighting under a government banner, but they're actually fighting for their own local interests. So the Agwalek are fundamentally fighting both for economic control of the corridor going all the way up into Sudan, which is why you've seen the recent fighting in Wichpanyekang for the Shilako Wunkir, for the Padang. And then you also see in Western Equatoria the most violent conflict, which is effectively where the government has effectively outsourced the conflict to Nando and the Zande militias, which are now cross-border and also include fighters from both the Democratic Republic of Congo and from the Central African Republic. And what you see in both Upper Nile and in Western Equatoria, and I think they're just exemplary cases, is increasingly the conflict takes on politically ethnicized dynamics as the government outsources the conflict and sets local militias against local populations. So my last point is simply, what does one do there? I think it is salutary for the international community to reflect on the fact that after many billions of dollars spent on democracy, there is no more popular legitimate institution in this country today than the White Armies. And I say that because the White Armies are at least chosen from their membership, as opposed to being imposed top-down by a technocratic dictatorship, which emerges from the 2018 agreement in Juba. which is not to say the white army should be considered our heroes, and they've done a series of terrible things, for sure. On the other hand, what you see today are communities forming themselves against the government, because the government has become the oppressor in chief, the encroachment on territory, the displacement of communities, and communities have reacted against that by creating their own forms of popular, legitimate, armed resistance to that rule. Now, of course, the difficulty with that, and this is the point I'll end on, is that those forms of popular legitimacy are rooted in the community. And they have been very clear that what they're not going to do is take political power. That's been left to the IO. But the problem with the IO there is that they can be very easily instrumentalized and reincorporated within the government. The series of defections we've seen makes that exemplary. So we see in South Sudan a place in which the existent political projects are broken. The state-building project is broken. The SPLM has been disintegrated and fractured beyond belief. I was just with Oyeding and Match Paul and the rest of them in Kampala. Like, there is no possibility of a genuine reformulation without Kiir splintering them. The government itself is fractured. And the problem is, outside of community resistance, there isn't a political project that currently can serve as a locus of hope in this country. And I'll pass it over to James, who I hope has happier things to say.
Well, thanks, Joshua. And so, yes, to build on that, I'd like to pass things over to Bol. And I do apologize for the technical mishap of mine, which I'm responsible for. And Bol is actually not Joshua Craze, as his name associated with his image may indicate.
But I wish I was Bol Gatkouth.
And nor is this a Kiirism, to use Joshua's term, strategy of a non-strategy. It's purely my fault. So apologies for that, Bol. But to build on Joshua's comments, Bol, how are communities in Jonglei and Upper Nile interpreting these dynamics that Joshua has described, particularly around the politically ethnicized dynamics? And perhaps you could also provide some comments concerning the stagnation of the peace agreement and Mashar's current position, and how is that understood among Nuer more generally, and in particular within White Army circles? Over to you, Bol.
Thank you very much, Chris, and it's nice to be with you guys. First of all, let me just give a little background of what Joshua actually, if you want me to build on what he actually first said about Bol Mel and also the succession plan. Kiir, to be honest, had been for a very long time, since 2005, he have get something that he had built on. And he started actually with his differences. The issue started differences between Kiir and John Garang when they were reconciling in Rumbek. Of a sudden of death of John Garang, the SPLM, who is supposed to be a ruling party, he had been hijacked with certain group. And Kiir actually left the entire SPLM elite, who was actually all SPLM ruling class, and that they have been differ with them, which is seen, you look at them like John Garang in some point. So he came, the first government was formed by Bona Malwal. Bona Malwal led Bona Malwal, rest in peace, just recently died. And then also Justin Yaj, Dr. Justin Yaj, and Dr. Lama Kol. These were the first three group, three individuals plus Kiir. They were the first who formed the government of the SPLM in Khartoum, as well also in Juba. And the rest of the SPLM Garang Kol, they was actually left, on the coal, and even they was supposed to be, politically eliminated or politically discarded from the system of governance or from the CPA implementation. Now, and then these three, they was actually in charge for political side, and the security sector. Sulfur did not even work with SPLM general in Bilfam. He's actually working with the Paulina Matip, who was at the time as a deputy commander-in-chief, because Paulina reconciled with Sulfur, with a backup from Khartoum, and he was given that 50,000 troops within the SSDF that he was integrated in the SPLA, which most of the SPLA general of Grand Corps, they were not even accepted them at all. So then Sulfur was working in the security sector with Paulino. So now, then after that, after they clashed with Bona and Justin Jai died, and then Lama Kol was dismissed from Minister of Foreign Affairs. Then later on, Sulfur moved back, to Garankor, led by Pagana Mum. So he's actually appointed them in the government in Juba, in the national government Juba, as well also in the Southern Sudan. Riek actually was used as a target as a symbolic person, even though he was a deputy for Sulfur in South Sudan. Then the Garang Corps, they were the real threat for Sulfur. And what happened? This is what actually, when they came to the government, this is where, after the independence, then follow immediately, the 2013, because the successions of Sulfur is started from there. When this group, they come up, they want to go for election, and they want to choose who will be a flag bearer for the SPLA, because Sulfur interim period twice is already over. Now, Riek was invited in by this group because he was back, he have a constituency. And the majority of the Grand Corps, they didn't have constituencies. Those of Pagan and many others, they were not. So Riek was co-opted to this group to come and get a backup, by Nuer, militia and the Nuer population, as well also the forces who are loyal to Paulino Matip. Now, when the split happened in 2013, Riek was assuming that he will be leading the group that he had been with them during the campaign of secession of Sulfur after the independence. Then Riek was also rejected by this group because the project that they were needing him, it was not successful. And then people now going for war, and then the Nuer and the forces, because Nuer by the time, if I'm not wrong, they actually leading up to 35% in the armed forces of the SPLA. Now, Pagan was arrested, and Riek also appointed Pagan to be the chief negotiator, because with assumption that the group will continue with this period of the press conference that they was trying to call, and also secession of the SPLM chairmanship of the ruling party in Southern Sudan. But they rejected. I was actually in the meeting in Addis Ababa when they came, and they worked hardly to make sure that those guys they should be released. And Pagan was appointed in prison as a negotiator, as I mentioned earlier. But in the meeting, Pagan said to Riek, "You actually danger my life of putting my name to be a negotiator while I'm in prison." Anyway, Pagan is congratulating himself because he actually win the case in the court case, like what Riek is experiencing now in Juba. Now, so this group, they gone, and Sulfur actually have a space, political space, because these are the threat within the SPLM tradition that they should be the successor, of the ruling. Because Sulfur, when he was appointed, he was as a chairman of the SPLM-IO. SPLA. John Garang, after John Garang, he was actually appointed because to curb down the division within the SPLM, and the right of self-determination was a unifying factor for South Sudan to unite for that matter. So Sulfur knows about that. He knows in his head that he's going to be, scrapped out after independence of South Sudan. But he used his way. Now, after this group left, then Sulfur came in with another group. He came with a Jing Council of Elders. The Jing Council of Elders, hello there? Are you there?
Yeah, we can hear you, Paul.
Okay, I think I miss Khristopher. So now you hear me? You hear me?
Yeah, I can. I don't know.
Yes, Paul.
Okay, all right. Now, the Young Council of Elders came in, and they were actually rescuing the situation, because Kiir also, they see Kiir become isolated from the SPLM, and then they feed themselves in into in the vacuum that had been left out by the SPLM leaders, and this is where the Jing Council of Elders, they came with the idea of a national dialogue that to keep things moving, where the national dialogue also they have been nationalized to be a part and parcel of the national of South Sudan national dialogue instead of this. That now the united, most of the Southern Sudanese political leaders who were not in the rebellion movement, then they came with idea of reconciling and governance system, rule of laws, and so many things. Now, the problem also occurs when the resolution come out from the national dialogue, then they demand of removal of Salva Kiir himself. It was late Bol Malol himself who was the co-chair, because the chairman was Angelo Beda, and then co-chair was Bona, and also other elders. They were there. They demand Salva to step down immediately so that to suit the national reconciliation and healing in South Sudan, and government of South Sudan will go to the election in transition government, maybe most likely into caretaker government, or if self-accepted, he actually lead the caretaker government, and for the election, which he will not be participated in that election. Now, Sulfur actually was disappointed. He dismissed the Jain Council of Elders. Even today, you will not hear relationship between Sulfur and Jain Council of Elders, because they demand what Sulfur was not expecting from them. Now, Sulfur moved to another group. He moved to young generation. This young generation, this is where Bull Mail become a part of the group. So as a secession, because Bull Mail actually what he has done is was a very excessive, political ambitions, very excessive, very violent in terms of, after he had been decorated by so many ranks and from armed forces with owning the oil money of the Western Upper Niles, because the Western Upper Nile is not accountable of revenue, is actually owned by Bull Mail. I don't know what's happening after they have been removed now. So now, Bull Mail, he becomes so ambitious, very speedy, very aggressive in terms of pushing even his own boss away, in instead of, try to assimilate and also accepting winning Kiir, in terms of reality. But there was a little bit likelihood, because Bull Mail pushed many people away, pushed Turkel, pushed many others, those who actually have, with some kind of financial gains. So he pushed them away. Those also, so he moved to the forces, including the guard of Salva Kiir Mayardit himself. So Bull became a threat, but he made many enemies within them, where not only the whole South Sudan, within the Dinka core in particular, those who are actually very close to Sulfur. Now, Bull has been pushed away. Bull has been pushed aside, has been actually end up, I don't know, in house confinement like Riek or whatever. This is what happened. Now, Sulfur came to the family, where Adud become more, playing a big role in terms of reconciliation, in terms of seeing, try to, to put a good picture of her dead face, try to make sure that he can reconcile the leadership of President Salva to Southern Sudanese people. The jubilation of South Sudanese in the street of Juba when Bull Mail was actually removed from power. It was seen that Bull was the enemy, was the public enemy to South Sudanese. Of course, that is actually what the picture have been painted about him. But is really Bull Mail himself, or Selfie himself is the one giving Bull Mail all this kind of power and so on? Moving
Bol,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. If you could just wrap up with a couple of concluding comments, and then we'll
Yes.
pivot over to James. Thanks.
Yes. Now the last point is a tribal fighting or ethnic fighting inside South Sudan. If you see in Upper Nile, some communities, they never have a peace since 2005. If you take the Shulu Kingdom, they will never have a peace. Johnson Ulo and many others, there was no peace in Shulu Kingdom. The new White Army, even 2013, they never reconciled with the government of South Sudan because the reconciliation or the peace agreement was signed by the SPLA-IO, not including those who are fighting with government. Because Riek agenda of fighting the government is absolutely different from the White Army, who was actually revenging of the Nuer killing in 2013, and also rescuing the Nuer was actually put in jungle. I mean, in rescue in Upper Nile. If you see also, if you go to Western Equatoria, which of course most of us, the readers of our community, the Western Equatoria, Arab boys and many others, I'm sure Joshua is very good on this because he has been making a lot of research, dissertation, and writing on that. And of course, you can link up also the issue of that into the Western Bar Gazelle. I think I agree with so many things with Joshua in terms of ethnicizing of the community, which actually give benefit to Sulfur to divide the community because no coherent, there's no unity factor among South Sudanese, including also political and also the military, are divided into ethnic, divide, and also that actually helps Sulfur to continue to rule.
Thank you very much, Bol. James, I'd like to shift over to you now and help us understand from where you are, being from Lakes and closer view on some of the things that are happening more in the center of the country and around those areas where you are. To speak to some of the broader dynamics that Joshua and Bol have described for us and how things are playing out for ordinary people and local governance systems within perhaps the greater Bar Ghazal region or in Lakes in particular. But first, I would just also like to remind all of our attendees that if you have any questions, to please put those into the Q&A box and we'll get to those. And those, of course, can cover any range of topics that you are interested in, from succession scenarios to the agreements, conflict dynamics in any of these areas that have been mentioned, and a number of other topics. So please put in some questions and we'll get to those in a moment. But James, in the meantime, please, over to you.
Thanks, Khristopher, and also thanks Joshua and Bol for this comprehensive overview. I would pick up from Joshua's assertions on Kiir having no succession plan. And this is quite clear in many ways. For example, a lot of people, I remember there was some conversation I came across separately when he was asked about the succession plan, and he said point blank that they would get the same seat the way I got it. Technically means that when Garang died, he got it. He wasn't told by Garang to take over from him. And again, we could see, for example, also on the second point that Joshua made on putting people against each other, for example. And it has been the same case with Malone against Kol, was also Bol against Kol. And again, people say also it was Nial against Bol Mel, but Nial couldn't understand the dynamics, so he had to flee. But again, if he was within the country, maybe he would have been made most probably the vice president. That's something debatable. But again, with regards to Lake State, we have interesting figures in Lake State and when it comes also to succession plan. And one of them is General Rinkley, the current governor of Lakes. And during the sacking that week when Bol was sacked, and then the appointment he had left, but during the sacking, he came to Juba the same day when Bol was sacked in the evening. And there were a lot of rumors going around that he would be the next vice president. But then stories went around. I think also Kiir was advised, they were telling him, you're getting another Malone. But this now, he would not wait until you sack him. You could even get rid of him. So he now chose Wani again over him. And before the appointment of Wani, I think he had a word, so Ring went by road back to Lake State. And again, now people are still wondering what she was told, what his plans are. And again, coming back to Lake State and how the governance systems are with the succession plan in the hindsight, General Ring was appointed to Lake when there was a lot of instability. Lake State is one of the interesting states within the country and also in the whole of Barghazal region. They have a lot of internal issues with regards to cattle rustling and then revenge killings. And by the time Ring was appointed, there was so much that before then, I remember President Kiir going there twice and again saying he would bring half of the cabinet to Lake State to ensure that stability is restored. But when Ring was appointed, I mean, with a lot of human rights violations with regards to how regards to extrajudicial killings, the state has now gone into the state of stability, somewhat relative stability until recently. So the methods are questionable, but his approach is quite holding in the sense that not so much infighting is going on among the communities in Lake State. But again, his control is limited since Lake State is also bordered by Unity State and then also Warab, who are also having cattle raiders who come and raid Lake State. But then he does not have control over it. Now, the question comes again with how, for example, he could also prevail over the other states. It's still, I would say, this is something he cannot do. And I know he has the backing of the president, for example, in doing what he does in Lake State, but not. Again, many people have been thinking that he would be the successor in many ways. And a lot of discussions have been going on with Lake State people thinking that the next president would probably come from Lakes. But again, picking up from the point of Joshua on how also the president picks, for example, influential people and make them influential actually from smaller communities. Rin comes from Atwot, and there are debates by anthropologists that whether Atwot is a Dinka or not a Dinka, but they call them a different tribe. But they are small community within Lake State. So it's easy for him to remove him whenever he wants, which is that plan. Again, it comes to the point, the current Secretary General of the SPLM comes also from a very small Dinka subsection of Agar in Quebec Center. Again, it falls into the line of bringing up people that you can easily get rid of. And again, expanding on to the whole of Greater Barghazal, I think they have different dynamics, like I said. It's mostly about cattle rates within lakes and also Warab, but the ones of Western Equatoria are more to do with the IO and again, farmers within the Luo community and the Dinka of Warab. Again, what do these dynamics say about, what the international community could learn from or maybe do? It's again, not thinking about Lake State from a greater context of for example, rebellions or no rebellions, or maybe in a sense that what else could we do different? Because when we talk about interventions on peace building, it's always about Great Upper Nile. Now it's also now about Equatorias, most probably also on Western Equatoria, but Lakes is also has been a different case, and also the whole of Barghazal, because those appear internal, but they are also influenced by the national conflicts, for example. The internal conflicts that happen and also the arming of the youth also is related to the current political players at the national level. For example, Kol was accused of arming his own kinsmen to fight another Dinka red communities around. Same case as Rin, because if you look at Rin now, they say, which is true, he has 4 more administrative areas, administrative units within his home county compared to the others. And again, Rin has had his own issues also with a lot of accusations of corruption, for example, and again, extrajudicial killings that are targeted to communities that are not close or related to him. And again, I don't want to go again around and maybe saying much more, but again, I would agree, like I said before, coming back to Joshua's points of Kiir appointing people that he makes bigger in a sense, based on, and then he removes them, ensuring that also they come from smaller communities that may not have leverage once or maybe they may not come back once, fight back once their kinsmen are removed. And two, also the fact that he has no succession plan. And again, Lake State feel like they have a chance somehow after Kiir, and that's what they know. Because when Kiir is there, no one talks about replacing. Up to Khristopher, if you have specific questions that we want to follow up.
Thanks, James. We've got some questions that have come in, and so there's one here that follows up on the related to the succession comments that all of you have been touching on. And this has to do with the elections, and the question is, what is the probability that elections will take place next year? As well as, is there a scenario where Kiir dies and there isn't any eruption of violence? So without a succession plan, what is the real risk in terms of stability or escalation of conflict dynamics in South Sudan should Kiir not make it to the elections? Who would like to take the first go with that question?
Yeah, maybe I could cover the election bit, or maybe it depends. Yeah?
Go ahead, James.
Okay. Now, the elections, I think elections have a lot of their own issues. A lot of them are political, others are logistical, but all also packed onto logistics. And in many ways, everyone, most of the parties are reluctant, for example, and there are splinters for now. If you look at the IO, we have the one of Par and Bachar. If you look at the SPLM, somehow Kiir prevails. But again, if you look at the OPP and the SOA, they have all splintered. And there are also new entrants to the political arena since the Nasser incidents. And they would want to keep the status quo because they know once the elections come, most of them might not hold their current positions. And again, with regards to violence, this is a big likelihood, especially when you take in context, because South Sudanese are also, they are into social media, for example. They know what has happened in Kenya, for example, in the riots and also the Tanzanian elections. Again, this is a big likelihood in a sense that they would want to, replicate or maybe also think the same way as the Kenyans did to hold account their leaders. But the thing is, I'm not sure, like you said, this is going to happen for many reasons. Kiir is reluctant, other parties are reluctant. How much they want to use this as a way of dragging feet on the ground to see what happens. But they are just buying their time, and I'm pretty sure elections may not happen as planned. And then if they do or they don't, there's always a likelihood that violence will be around. How do we, for example, ensure that they happen, or maybe violence doesn't happen? This is a question for the international community and the political leaders in South Sudan. Back to you, Khristopher.
Thank you, James. Joshua, elections next year?
Just two quick points. I think it's worth the international community reflecting on the fact that it is the system of the hierarchis itself that is one of the major blocking points to elections, because as James rightly says, there's a lot of vested interests of people who have positions and have power which will be threatened by those elections. And there seems to be such a sufficient groundswell of resistance to elections from the elite that no matter what Salva wants, which is of course ambiguous and always changing, it seems unlikely that you'll actually get elections. What's much more likely is that you'll get an agreed upon extension with the IO. And in terms of the second question, is there a scenario where Kiir dies and there isn't an eruption of violence? I think it's important to say, one, there is an eruption of violence in 7 out of 10 states. So we're already in a situation of widespread war across the country. But the Salva's ruled by building up his own legitimacy and disrupting everybody else's. So even if there was a situation in which, say, Aduk could take power, which seems improbable to me, but if there was where she could take power with the backing of at least some of the elite from Barakhazal and from Jonglei around sort of a single Dinka candidate, it seems very unlikely that they would be able to maintain power And I think what will happen after Salva is a consistent switch of candidates and presidents. And if you see what Salva did in the cabinet and in the positions of governorship, what there was he maintained rule by constantly substituting candidates. I think that sort of substitution will now come to affect the actual presidency itself.
Thanks, Joshua. A follow-up question that I'll place after this, and that is a question from one of our attendees concerning Adut. Will she be built up and only be knocked down again? Of course, it's a bit trickier, being that she's part of the family circle. What are your thoughts concerning her?
I mean, quickly, and then I'm interested in what the other two panelists have to say. But the people that he can't knock down fully are the family, right? That's one of the main findings of the situation update on Bomel that Small Arms Survey will put out next week or the next. So it's not so much that she will be built up and knocked down as much as will she be able to gain the acceptance of the elites in Juba towards the succession plan. And that's on the one hand possible because there is the family lobby around Gregory Vasily and the First Lady, but it's still unclear whether or not she'll face the same problems that Bomel did, which is to say that she's an interloper and she's not part of the SPLM elite that fought the war.
James.
Yeah, quickly on the same. I think some of the people that Kiir also built up is not for political reasons. I think it's for financial reasons. It's a way of helping himself siphon out money. And Adut is one of those that she brought close to him so that whenever these financial deals are happening, she does them behind the scenes. Again, in the same sense that Kiir also builds up opponents within his systems. Adut already has an opponent technically his current second wife, who is also close to the president, the special envoy to the Middle East. And if anything happens, she could be her replacement for now because she's also technically part of his family.
Thanks, James. Bol, I want to come over to you. We have another question, and this concerns the Nuer. And the question is, what are the main political military divisions within the Nuer community? And in particular, what are the current dynamics revolving around the Bol Nuer?
Well, I don't know the Nuer army, but what I know, the SPLA-IO, who is now fighting in Equatoria, they are not Nuer and they are more organized. The SPLA-IO in Barghazal, particularly in western Barghazal, these people, they are also well organized. If you talk about the White Army as such, the White Army, they will never advance they are not even demanding the issue of the government. But in terms of the unity among the Nuer as a community is something different. But in the Bull Nuer, they have their own forces, which actually was integrated. And they have, of course, they are they are militia as such, but they are supporting Sulfur for sure. And these are the important allies to the government of South Sudan under Sulfur leadership. Now, after Toot has been reinstated as an advisor, I believe that the same Kuljang, who was also a commander of forces, will remain supporting Sulfur. The Lone Nuer, they seem to be more supporting, strategically supporting peace agreement. They are not involving at the moment in terms of fighting with the government at all. It is only White Army, and particularly in Nasser area, where most of the fighting and Fanjak, this is where the government was also, intensifying the air bombardment, also the fighting, what happened in Nasser. But in general, most of the Nuer area, they seem to be calm in terms of if you're talking about opposition in the government of now, the fighting remains with certain localities in the Nuer area. If you're talking about Jongole, you can count it recently, the visit of your guy in Akoba, where it delivered the message that of whatever, but it does not mean that the people really support the government. Neither they give up their arms or they are not supporting, the SPLM-IO. But the camps or there is some kind of people are really not aggressively trying to attack the government as what happened in Nasser or in Fanjak. So this the lack of the ammunition, in particular, the lack of seeing also Dr. Riek is in court, that now is actually in Juba, is also make people also seeing that there's some kind. Let the court decide it first. Some people are talking like that. So this is mostly what happening, but there's no in terms of the Nuer armed forces. There's nothing called Nuer army, but there is the SPLA opposition, SPLA opposition, and the Nuer White Army, which two organizations are parallel. They don't have one interest at all.
Thanks, Bol. Joshua, your hand is permanently raised. Did you have something?
No. I just wanted to add 2 points to Bol's excellent analysis very quickly. One was to say that, of course, I think among the Nuer, you see the Kiir's classic tactic, which is to say, how do you divide communities? So if you look at Nasser, on the one hand, you have a very strong IO commissioner who has a lot of popular support, but then the most important Nuer within the government right now is Simon Kunhiak, who of course is also from Nasser, who is the number 3 within the SPLM, and the new governor of Upper Nile, Dolar, is from the same region as Simon Kunhiak. So you see the government's attempt to try to split communities and divide them up, and that happens both at the state level in Juba, but also at a granular level in terms of their tactic of appointing commissioners in Ulang, Nasser, Fangjak, to try to break communities up. That was the first point. And then the second was, of course, that as much as the Bul Nuer have been such a government ally, there are important struggles within the Bul Nuer, both between Riek Beam and Ngwen Montouil, the last governor, and within Wat Mayom itself. And you've seen, for instance, in the recent supposed disarmament campaign, the Puljang's forces, who's the head of Division 4, which are actually a militia, put on SSPDF uniforms and went and attacked another Bul Nuer section. And Gat Diang, the Bul Nuer prophet, responded by saying, look, how can we ever believe in this government? Because what this government is just a bunch of our enemies dressed up in army uniforms.
Thanks, Joshua. We've got still a number of questions to work through. So I'll start with this one here, and I kindly request that you keep your answers as brief as you can so we can get to some of these others. This one here it's expected that the 2026 GHO to do with humanitarian assistance will see only marginal financing. How will aid delivery continue to be a part of the political economy of conflict in South Sudan? And how will this affect community survival strategies and subnational conflict dynamics? Joshua, you want to take a stab at that?
I think this year you've seen the outright blockage of humanitarian distributions to Nasser, east of Nasser town. The first distributions got in at the end of October after 6 months of being blocked. Unmissed didn't visit Nasser. You've seen the same thing in northern Jonglei. This is, of course, a strategy that goes back to the Second Sudanese Civil War. The strategy is to block humanitarian distributions to opposition-held areas and to push aid into government-held areas and to force populations into those areas to denude the opposition of support. I think in terms of the question, the decline of aid is creating an incredibly penurious situation across the country, not just because of the aid, but because of the massive amount of staff cuts there have been. And those people working for NGOs on relatively much better contracts, especially in the case where government salaries cease to be paid, support large extended families. And the cut of those jobs means that across the country, you have people who are increasingly desperate. So when I was in northern Jonglei a couple of months ago, the White Army fighters said very simply, these economic conditions themselves are a reason for us to go on a mut or a raid.
Thank you, Joshua. There's another question. Bol, you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, actually, in different places across South Sudan. But if you're talking about in Upper Nile in general or Great Upper Nile, the most of the NGOs, they are the one paying a lot of institutions have remained functional. The absence of the NGOs in for example, in education health system, it become is affecting many people, including also the food itself, food security. Now the big problem now had happened in particularly in these recent days in Baliet, where the river Sobat has been cut off, and even some boat sailors have been, killed by the security there in Balit, and it created a lot of political issues, also insecurity for the aid workers to walk around in those corridors, because there's no transport at all in South Sudan. I mean, there's no roads in South Sudan, only through the river, particularly during the rainy season. So, and this is a very critical time at the moment in terms of humanitarian delivery in Southern Sudan.
Thanks, Bol. Turning to another question. We have one here, starts with a comment. One would get the impression that there's no material basis for social relations in South Sudan. All there appears to be are personalities, guns, and ethnicities. A similar conversation might be had with regard to British district commissioners in the 1930s. Is this a fair comment? Joshua, would you like to respond to that?
I mean, I think if it's a fair comment, it's a limitation of our presentations and the limited amount of time we have. I think it's all material relations. I say that unsurprisingly as a Marxist. You cannot understand the elite in Juba without them surviving via extroversion, the term that Bayard used for how elites in globally subordinate positions exploit and try to manipulate their lesser place within a global economic system. You cannot understand anything about the Southern Sudanese political elite and Kiir's rise unless you understand it as partly a control of oil flows. Those oil flows, of course, are being taken out of the country on terms not decided by the South Sudanese people, and with the entire exclusion of local communities from those oil flows. I think at a lower level than the oil flows, which basically keep up the Juba elite, in Western Equatoria, Western Bahr Ghazal, as Eastern and Central Equatoria, the commanders are battling for their control over flows of gold and also of logging. And those flows themselves, of course, are not flows that the people of South Sudan really benefit from. The entire, I think, of Southern Sudanese political economy has to be understood from its subordinate position within the global economy, from its exploitation by that global economy, and from elites struggling to maintain what they can of a control over those processes.
Thanks, Joshua. There's a question here on Western Equatoria and whether the conflict there is politically motivated or intertribal between the Azande and Balanda. I'm going to refer, thank you for the question, but we'll have that publication coming out soon, within the next week or so. And I think your question will be answered there. But for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to another. We've got a couple here concerning NSS and Kol and SSPDF. One asks, would you be able to elaborate on the dynamics within the NSS post-Kol and the power dynamics between the NSS and the SPDF, and the Tiger Division in particular? James, Bol, we'll give Joshua a break. Either of you would like to comment on that?
Khristopher, just before you do, sorry, unfortunately, I have to jump off at 3. So I just wanted to thank you all for taking part. My email address is widely available, and I'm happy to answer any other questions by email or on WhatsApp.
Thanks, Joshua.
Yeah, quickly on this question, I think we can look at it at the wider context, because currently most of the people who staff the security services were loyalists of Bol men. But since he's gone now, they are trying to undo everything. So already we have at the SSPDF, the current CDF was an appointee that was an loggerheads with Bol men, so he will stay. But at the NSS, we think it's a matter of time, not if, but it's when these changes will happen. I think Tiger Division, they have already done, and this is already someone who was handpicked, I think, by Adut and her associates. So changes will come. It's just a matter of time.
Bol?
Yeah, but I think the central answer of this question is based on institution itself. There's no institution functional now where you can say the NSS either exists the way it used to be with our Kol, or the SPDF. The SSPDF is remain as an organized force in Bilfarm that they have a command. Because all these institutions now, there have been a lot of issues after the removing of the head. Then President Kiir appointed another one. So you cannot say anybody have a role or a control of the forces now in Southern Sudan. It's only President Salva who's now remained as a manipulator of those forces or all the institutions currently in South Sudan.
Thanks, Bol. Maybe we'll just try one or two more questions and then we'll wrap things up. One here is concerns the UPDF and whether Kiir is dependent on the UPDF to stay in power at this moment. Looking ahead into 2026, what will be the role of the UPDF in supporting Kiir in his position? And what is the end game of Operation Mlinzi wa Kima is the operation. I wish I could translate that. And what is your take on that, Bol, with regard to the UPDF and Kiir's relationship?
Well, actually, President Museveni has been a lieutenant to Salva Kiir, if he's not the one acting as a co-chair or co-president in South Sudan. Since 2013, he's actually been visited Bor in Jonglei State without President Salva to go with him. So the UPDF, they have a central role to keep Salva in power. Even though many people have been talking these days that Bol Mel paying the money and all these kind of things, I doubted that because it was not Bol Mel who actually always invited. Museveni himself, he got his own, interest, not only in South Sudan, beyond South Sudan, including Sudan. What is happening in Darfur, RSF, and so many other things that involving Museveni try to larger his own space in the region, actually, to be honest. Now, for UPDF in current situation, their problem will be if the South Sudan will be reconciled, if Riek Machar is going to be brought out, or the national reconciliation to constitute the national government of South Sudan that will actually take the South Sudan, back to its own independence. But otherwise, as long as Salva is still defending himself from whoever want to threat his political leadership, UPDF will be there.
Thanks, Bol. Why don't we go for some concluding comments? But I will pose one final question from our attendees. If you choose to consider this question within your closing comments, I'll leave that up to you. And the question is, do you think President Kiir is satisfied with the status quo and level of violence in the interior as long as it can hold Juba and its resources? Or is there any kind of is there a more ambitious state building project that is still of any interest in Juba? Bol, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, you know what happening? I think Joshua will challenge me for this because this is talent. When his talent become old, what he has done, he gave some of his power to very close, close friends that he's in control, and power remain only in criminal. I mean, in Moscow. At some point, he Salva himself, he have nothing to do. He said in his own mouth, he said, I will protect myself with my small forces. Those who are fighting outside of Juba or outside of his own control zone, then if you are defeated at war, you come to me, I will protect you. But don't open your mouth again. So Salva is not even interesting, for state building and all, because the whole thing is collapsed. He now is owning the oil revenue. He owned all the revenue in the country of gold and other things. He's a family that the one taking all the resources, including even the donation, the borrowers, from UAE and so on, and many other places across South Sudanese friends. So Salva is satisfied only to be in Juba. Even the election that you have been talking earlier for, Salva, he will be going to the election like what happened in 2000 in Bashir time when Bashir went for election and Salva, withdrawing Yasser Arman, and the whole thing was arrangement of South Sudan to get independent. Salva, actually, all these parties in Juba, they will be elected Salva with a consensus, in the center where sulfur will not even visit any part of the last point is sulfur, it never visits different part of South Sudan since it become South Sudan become independent. So it doesn't even care about what is happening. As long as in control, unless the fighting is inside Juba in J1, like what happened those days. If Riek was actually holding on for some time in Juba, this is where the problem will come. And they were planning also to move somewhere else. But anyway, I believe that sulfur will remain in Juba. As long as it's there, no problem.
Thanks, Paul. James, finally, for your concluding comments, perhaps you're less pessimistic about the state building in South Sudan. Is there any opportunity for this that you can see? Is there any real interest in doing something of this nature in South Sudan?
Yeah, I think I'll pick up from your point of being pessimistic. I think most of us are. And in a sense, I'll also start with where Bol stopped, with whether he cares about what happens at the countryside. Because currently, I was speaking to one military officer, and he said the most well-armed unity within South Sudan is the Tiger Division, which is the entire bodyguards of Salva, not national security. And again, he knows that most of the greater Balgazal, it's not how much most of them hate Salva. They wouldn't want to remove him for someone that comes from another region. So he banks on that. And thirdly, also, he knows he has also outsourced his fight. I mean, whether it's fighting, he has outsourced to his militia. So his place is secure and he doesn't look beyond himself. Now, on peace building, I think it's not something that also crosses Kiir's mind because he benefits from the chaos. It's not here to say like, because once South Sudan is peaceful, people will demand for social services, schools, health care centers, roads. But now he's happy to say like, the country is unstable. How can I do this when this is happening? So that's where we are, South Sudanese. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, James, and thank you, Bol. We'll wrap this up now, and let me also thank all of our attendees and for your excellent questions. I very much appreciate you joining our webinar today. Just to remind you all that we have these publications coming out over the next couple of weeks. So if you're on a survey mailing list or otherwise are able to keep track of us on social media, we'll be announcing those releases as they happen. And so I hope that you will find those useful as well. So thank you all very much. Be well and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, James and Bol. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.